But let's open the floor for questions and remarks and see where we will be going. Let's take 3 questions first. The 2 gentlemen there.
Hi, my name is Sonra Lambert-Bai. I work for Dan Church-Aid as a peace advisor. Basically, I just have a question to the panel, springing on from what Sebastian just mentioned. Could any of you say a little bit more about how you think the UN could support regional multilateral responses to violent conflict, wherever that might be?
Yep.
Bjarke Winter from Aalborg University. I read that Edward Locke said in his book on how not to reform the UN that political convergence almost always precedes institutional change in the UN, and I think also generally. And I was just wondering, given that that book is from 2000, or that piece is from 2005, what sort of trends do you see in the positive sense of where we perhaps could look for political convergence to spawn institutional change or reform?
Thank you. And if I think he was first. If he started, then I know him.
Thanks a lot. My name is Ib Petersen. I was until the end of last year, a few weeks ago, the permanent representative of Denmark in New York, and having worked quite a lot the past 2 years on reforms. It's always interesting to see 2 years of your life being described in a more academic fashion, as we have heard here. But I think it's very precise. So it's very interesting. Just very shortly, some reflections, and then I know I have to come with a question as well. So but I think when discussing the reform, you have to realize also that not all member states want the reform. In particular, Russia and China didn't want it. Fine, things are going fine. So what's the problem? And that has been the point of departure, both for the Secretary General, but for the rest of the member states as well. And in that respect, also referring to this morning's discussion, the reforms is actually an area where you could find some common ground with the US, and that has been seen as from the Secretary General side. Okay, so let's try to build on that at least, and I think that's very wisely done. But I think some of the areas, Raimonda, and I have, what she did when she was on the council, tremendous, fantastic efforts. But I don't think we'll get the council reforms very soon. So how can we work through the working methods to actually make it more meaningful? One example, not in the council, but in the General Assembly, the selection process of the Secretary General. That's actually an area, and it was going in parallel with efforts on the Security Council. It was clear that there was a lot of pressure from a number of states and groups of states that normally are very not aligned in the G77, China and so on. But they said, now we really want some influence here. And we succeeded in making a resolution that gave that influence much more actually than China and Russia. I think they have anticipated, and they were a bit taken by surprise. And that's why I think they keep on to the Security Council as it is. My question is perhaps, why is it, because you both, Sebastian and Sam, have background in the UN, why is it that always when we have a reform of the UN, when things are supposed to be done more effectively, it costs more money? There's always immediately a price tag. You can't do anything and go back and see, can we do it better with the funds we have? You will always have a price tag. The price tag on the UN development system reform is a good example. The Secretary General told the member states, currently we are running the resident coordinator system at a cost of 170 million per year. We want to improve it. That will cost an additional 85 per year. That's 255 million per year. That's what I'm asking from the member states. So some of us said, what happened to the 170 million that you already have in the system, in the UNDP and other places and so on? And the thing is, of course, UNDP will still need some money to have their country directors. But I also think that his proposal was a compromise among different groupings within the system. Okay, we will say yes to your reforms, but we don't want to give up any of our money for that. So how do we somehow get rid of that or change that kind of behavior. Sam talked about, culture in the system. I think that's one place. And then I really agree with Sebastian on the point that you have political decisions taken in different fora in the UN, and then you have the fifth committee, the budgets. It is totally ridiculous that the Security Council, when they discuss a new peacekeeping mission, why don't they have a budget at the same time and say, this is what it's going to cost, so if you're not and you agree to this, please make sure we have the money as well. Thank you.
We'll take the replies to these three questions, and then we'll have Finn afterwards, and then to be fair with the left wing of the group, then you'll have some others afterwards. But we'll start with these three questions by Mark. First.
So quickly on all three, Sonal, how can we best support regional organisations? I think the Hippo report recommendation that UN-assessed contributions can be used to fund AU peace operations is a good one. We saw in December that it's fairly dead in the water at the moment, but I think that's the most tangible way. In the absence of that, I think looking at the way that we conduct Security Council negotiations much earlier to get out of the kind of the block mentality and find out what the bottom lines of different groups are, talk to the AU peace and security architecture, the three African non-permanent members of the council earlier is helpful. A second question on political convergence to kind of spurn initiatives. Two examples. One is something that the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung think tank in New York is attempting to do, is how do you deepen EU cooperation at the UN at a time that multilateralism is under challenge from elsewhere? And then in particular sectoral areas, looking at unusual alliances. I think there's a real opportunity for the EU and China to cooperate in leadership on climate change in multilateral space. The third question was really a series of questions. You said building on the sort of 1 for 7 billion campaign on selection of the Secretary General, what are the kind of the equivalents today? I think the opportunities are to look at breaking down the North-South mistrust at the UN by unusual alliances. Kofi Annan used to use quietly 5 ambassadors from each of the 5 electoral groups to have breakfast meetings and kind of take processes forward slowly, and I think that could be emulated by the current SG. You asked a clear question that needs answering of why is it that the UN can't reform without requiring more money? And I think I'm not an automatic defender of the UN, but on this case I think I very much am, that it's always possible to try and do things better with less money, but when you're so micromanaged and it's not possible for a Secretary General to actually move money and allocate it from one post to another, it's much harder to actually bring about the kind of reforms that a CEO of a company would be able to do. So I think that a lot of member states, on the one hand, micromanage, on the other hand, require that kind of magic. I think really need to look at the restraints that they're putting on the UN. But even within that, yes, let's hope that it's not all about money. I think a lot of it is about culture, and that really is about leadership at the top. And there's a lot you can do being an inspired leader to get a lot more out of people, and I think that is an opportunity.
Thank you. Raimonda?
Thank you. I'll, from memory, because I haven't worked on UN for the last 2 years, how to engage with regional organizations and how to help them, get a stronger footing in what the UN does. From our own experience, I think engaging them matters a lot. Because again, I would like to go back to experience we had with sanctions committees and with the counterterrorism committee that I was chairing. We did the first ever the trip of the chair of the counterterrorism committee, which was myself at the time, to the Sahel region to see issues in a regional perspective, not what Mali faces in terms of terrorism, not what Niger faces in terms of terrorism, but what the region faces in terms of terrorism, and try to come up with regional approaches. What we did was to take with me the then special representative of Secretary General for the Sahel region, but also the African Union's special representative for counterterrorism, For some reason, nobody's ever tried to link this chair of the CTC with the representatives of regional organizations, which doesn't make sense to me. We did, and it worked, and the discussions in the region that we had and the ideas that came up were surprisingly good. The problem was afterwards, as I said, when, you know, after the whole trip, the report is written up by the staff, and that report doesn't live up to the expectations. But again, the very fact that we spoke together with the representative of the African Union, with the representative for the Sahel region, with governed people in individual countries, I think matters a lot. The same we did with sanctions regimes. While working on Central African Republic, we engaged all regional, sub-regional organizations that deal with Central Africa. As we talked to the government of Central African Republic, but we talked with everybody who works in the region and who has a stake in the success or failure of the country, but also the region. These are little steps, but again, I usually prefer incrementalism instead of big talk because, you know, big talk evaporates, while the little steps that we make in changing the organizational culture, in changing how we operate, matters a lot. With regards to the convergences and everything, I'm not sure it's exactly to the point, but somebody earlier today referred to the General Assembly taking a more serious role. And one of the things which I found inspiring and surprising at the same time was how much a tiny country like Liechtenstein can do to mobilize over 100 countries, members of the United Nations, on a specific issue. One such specific issue was the code of conduct, the code of conduct on limiting the use of veto. The other was when Security Council was completely hopelessly stuck on Syria accountability, create a separate mechanism under General Assembly which would deal with accountability in Syria. These things can be done. Again, variable coalitions and things like that. And the last thing is what we can do to build up on Secretary General's election, going back to Security Council and elections of non-permanent members. The World Federation of United Nations Associations has tried to have open hearings of candidates to the Security Council. It may not work. Some of the candidates refuse to go and talk. But again, if we want to increase transparency and make them more accountable for what they do on the Security Council, let's push them out of their comfort zone and make them talk and make them respond to questions from wherever they might come from, any corner of the world, that engage and make them feel responsible for the role they're going to assume.
I'll pick up two of the questions, and Sam already responded to them quite well. The first one is how the UN can support regional responses to crises. Sam mentioned the recommendation in the Peace Operations Panel, the HIPPO, on putting peacekeeping, of regional peacekeeping on assessed funding. I think there are two more maybe. One is, and the Security Council does that quite regularly, they endorse regionally brokered peace agreements, for instance, so that gives a great deal of legitimacy to a regional process. The second one is that the UN quite often supports regionally led efforts through technical expertise, in particular in the area of mediation. And that's actually one of the very positive institutional reforms that came out of the 2004-2005 reform process, is the establishment of a very serious professionalized mediation capacity in the Department of Political Affairs. They have a mediation support unit, they have a mediation standby team, and they do not only support UN efforts, they're actually explicitly designed to also support regional efforts, and they are deployed to regional efforts. Now, that said, I do think that the UN has become a little too differential to regional organizations, in particular the AU. It is not that the AU is always, by definition, better placed to take the lead in regional peace processes in their region. They're often divided themselves, have often not always just positive interests. And I do think the UN at times could be a little more assertive. The second question I wanted to quickly respond to is why does reform always need to take money? In general, the UN is very well aware that any kind of change needs to take place within existing resources. And of the entire reform package that the Secretary General offered, the one on UN development system reform and the RC reform in particular is actually the only one that comes with a price tag. And I think it was a mistake. I don't think there was necessarily a need to split the RC function from the UN, from the ResRep function of UNDP. It could have well stayed there, all the while RCs can report to the DSG instead of UNDP. I think that would have been the much wiser choice, because now they maneuvered themselves into a big problem. But on a more general level, I agree that there is a problem here. Ban Ki-moon loved to say the UN needs to do more with less, which I think was a big mistake. Because the UN needs to learn to say, we need to do less with less, but that requires some prioritization on what do we do and what do we not do, and the UN is very bad at that, and Sam explained why the UN is very bad at that.
Thank you. I have noted that Finn wanted to say something, and you, and then Troels, so that would be 3 persons. First Finn.
Thank you. I'm still Finn Weske-Nielsen. I still worked at the UN for almost 40 years. Thanks to all 3 speakers. I must say, when you spoke, Sebastian, it awakened something in my brain. The man is right. I mean, negative as it may be, and it was negative, most of it, it probably shows us the nature of the beast. And the nature of the beast has always been it is 193 member states that have to agree on something. And therefore, we will always have these problems. And my general question, I have a general question and a specific one. The general question is the Secretary General, with the member states, barking up the wrong tree? Isn't he just tinkering at the edges? We shifted, make some departmental changes, with great brouhaha, we say we're now going to do all sorts of wonderful things, but they are really minor things within the broader organizational structure. So if we're barking up the wrong tree, what is the future of the United Nations? And by the way, I do recall I served under 5 different SGs, and I cannot remember a single one of them who did not start out by saying, now we have to reform this organization. It's not just 2 or 3, it's all of them, all the 5 I know. So that was a general question. The specific question has to do with this change that we've all talked about, the resident coordinators, and moving the resident coordinator to the Secretary General's office. I was never too sure whether that made any sense whatsoever, because I don't think that the mandate of the resident coordinator has changed. I may be wrong here. I don't think so. And if that is the case, in fact, this is counterproductive, because it means that rather than strengthening the coordination function at the country level, you render the resident coordinators essentially impotent. Thank you.
And we have 2 more, and you have to make it very, very short, because you are the only one, together with Troels and the repliers, that will stand in front of our wine afterwards. So make it short, please.
Quite some pressure. So my name is Silgert Kurtz from King's College London. So 2 quick questions. The first one to Sam and Sebastian. This new joint regional architecture by DPO, right? Department of Political Peace Operations, right? And DPPA. How much will that be able to also focus on long-term trends and prevention, and not just on then all managing operations? And second question to Raimonda, in your experience on the Security Council, how much were you able to focus on prevention and also, for example, work with resident coordinators?
And Troels, you have something, question? Yeah, okay.
promise it's actually a short question. Denmark has announced its candidacy for the Security Council in 2025. And I would just like to hear your advice a little bit from the panel. First, is it worth it? And if it is, then what would be your top tip for a prospective Danish PR at the Security Council? What's the most important thing for them to bring, whether it's processual or substantial or in terms of reform? Thank you.
Happily. Well, I'll start off with the very last one. I think we heard actually in the course of the day a lot of advice that Denmark would be well advised to heed on how to prepare, and I think Ambassador Loy and Raimonda gave us a lot to chew on. I would highlight in particular the importance of preparing very well, of having staff who develop a very serious expertise on country-specific files where you have peace operations. The lesson, and I think Lithuania is really an important example here, that even a small country in the Security Council can make a real difference if they work hard, especially in the area of sanctions. Now in the Security Council, the elected members are always the ones that chair sanctions committees. Ambassadors often grumble, saying this is tedious work. It is tedious work indeed, but the Security Council doesn't have that many tools. So to deploy those tools it has well, there is a premium on that. And sanctions implementation, there is a hell of a lot of improvement. And by having dedicated ambassadors who actually put a little bit of effort in there, and Ambassador Loy herself, she was chairing the CTC at the time, if I remember correctly, make a real difference by taking that seriously, by having staff who take that seriously, having sanctions coordinators and all that stuff. But there are a number of areas. I also would like to mention that I love to see elected 10 challenge the P5 a little bit. Not to just take for granted the system of penholdership, to challenge the pen holding, insist on co-pen holding, and sometimes throw up the body with maybe a draft resolution of their own confection, as New Zealand did, for instance, on the Middle East. I think the E10 need to be more coordinated and more cocky in challenging the P5 and loosening their stranglehold of the Security Council, because it's very, very bad for the body and leads to worse outcomes. Maybe just on the RC mandates. The RC mandates have not changed. The mandates of resident coordinators have not changed. But changing the mandates of resident coordinators would have been about as difficult as eliminating the veto system in the Security Council. There is just no way on earth you will get legislative change of the RC system through the General Assembly. So what we have to work with is how do we improve the role of resident coordinators, especially on prevention, within the system we have. And I think there is possibility to improvement. And I think we have seen in quite a number of country situations where resident coordinators have been able to play a very meaningful prevention role, even though they do not have a prevention mandate. We at UNU actually did a major study on trying to learn from successful past practice. And it is here, again, where incremental change is useful. We won't get the legislative structural change, but I do think through mutual learning of resident coordinators of what is possible within the constraints of the structure and the legislative architecture, we can achieve a lot.
Thank you. On prevention, it's not an easy question on the Security Council, because one of the instruments that have been used on various occasions was called horizon scanning. At the beginning of the presidency allows to lay out what could be happening in the area, what needs special attention. A number of countries killed it off. In 2015, DPA, then DPA, started an informal series of briefings on potential crises and potential situations for Security Council members who were interested in engaging on that. And I found them very useful. I don't know if currently these are being continued. But overall, the problem is, I think, that countries where things might begin to happen don't want to end up being on Security Council agenda. It's a sign of shame, you know. They'd better wait until things explode, and then you have full-blown crisis that the Security Council has to deal with. Again, culture, the approach needs to change. It's so much cheaper to prevent a crisis than to go through it and the whole destruction and the tragedies. That how do we entice the countries to address, to be willing to engage with the Security Council early? That's a big question. Mediation, a lot of that is done, and they're informal exchanges because mediation is a little bit more in Secretariat, but not exactly the Security Council's work, and the use of good offices. That's done quite a lot. I'm not sure about the specific numbers, but I remember Jeff Feltman at the time, the USG for Political Affairs, saying you don't hear about a lot of situations because there's, for example, 100, 150 situations where mediators are working currently, right now, and that's why these situations don't explode. So there's things happening in that respect. With regard to advice to Denmark, I think it's worth, especially now, when there's such a pushback on the normative achievements that the Security Council has had, and pushback on human rights, pushback on rule of law, on the principles and values, and an erosion of what the Council is supposed to. So the more voices that stand up firmly for that, the better. What you need to do, I think, and these are very practical and very primitive proposals, learn the procedures. On the Security Council, Russia is supposed to be the custodian of procedures who can manipulate whatever situation, kill whatever best idea and whatever best initiative. So don't fall for that trap and learn the procedures very well, and then dare to take the initiative, as you were saying. Because again, I remember we took up some of the issues, protection of journalists in conflict and then small arms in conflict. And we were told, no, don't go there. We could have stopped. We did go, and we had, I think, a very good resolution particularly on protection of journalists 2222, which is now referred to in various contexts for various other organizations. So it just don't stop when you're told not to proceed. Just push a little bit further. And then engage those who've been on a council before. Learn from the best experiences, learn from the worst mistakes, but reach out to friends, to partners, to countries who've been on the Security Council recently, also to some of the delegations which may not be very friendly, but they will have valuable lessons and cautionary tales to tell.
Thank you. So question one, is the Secretary General barking up the wrong tree on reform? Frankly, I think in order to get elected, he needed to demonstrate that he was willing to reform. And then in order to respond to the new reality, particularly in the American approach to the UN, I think he did an excellent job through Nikki Haley of keeping the UN protected during a very difficult time. His challenge now, with Nikki Haley's successor and with John Bolton now much more active in setting the US's UN agenda, is whether that honeymoon period is over. Secondly, whether the merger of or the creation of DPO and DPPA will lead to more longer-term planning and focus on prevention. I think there's no evidence that it will do, but that there have always been good units within the Secretariat, quite lightly staffed, the strategic planning unit in the SG's office, the mediation support unit in DPA, and the best practices lessons learned unit in DPKO. So I think one of the best things that a country like Denmark can do is actually provide extra budgetary funding to the more strategically orientated bits of the Secretariat to really enhance that work. And lastly, tips for Denmark for 2025. I think use 2020 as a key launching pad to promote a very distinct vision of what Denmark is offering. I think secondly to recognise that ultimately it's about the getting the votes in the General Assembly. So what is it how can Denmark leverage its particular relationships with individual regions and countries to achieve that. And thirdly, it's about visibility. And I think investing in a number of the really good multilateral think tanks between now and 2025 is one of the best ways to get a lot of bang for your buck. And in that capacity, I think the move of the UN News think tank, now run by Sebastian's colleague James Cochrane in New York, I think has become a really good focus for leveraging really good results in the UN Secretariat through using member state money wisely. So I think that's a good area. And then lastly, Sebastian's boss, David Malone, when he was an academic, wrote the best article on what really happens in Security Council elections, and this was from his experience as a Canadian ambassador to the UN. It's called Eyes on the Prize, and it's a really chilling account of some of the best and worst practice in pursuing a non-permanent seat, but it's definitely worth reading.
Well, thank you to all three speakers and to all the one who provided both long and short questions. It was a pleasure, and I think we left the meeting with a more positive feeling that there was actually ways forward so that we could make the UN a little bit stronger and more effective. Truls, do you have some final remarks? Then I think we should again thank the three organizing organizations, which is the Academic Council on UN System, and it's the UN, Danish UN Association and the University of Copenhagen for calling for this meeting. I think it was successful in terms of also a lot of participants, active participants. And I think again we need to say to Truls, who was the real organizer, a big thank you and a big hand for the work he did. Will you lead the way to the wine, Truls?